Hi, I'm Adam Natali, Director of SVA Theater at the School of Visual Arts. If you've never heard of SVA, we're a preeminent art and design college in New York City. Check the description below for more info. Since 2014, SVA Theater has hosted After School Special, the college's annual alumni film and animation festival. The festival is normally a series of free screenings followed by Q&As with alumni who are successfully working in the film industry. Even though we're unable to host in-person screenings this year, we're thrilled to be able to present interviews with over 25 alumni who've worked on a wide variety of feature films, television shows, documentaries, animated films, and more. Whether tonight's Q&A focuses on a particular series, film, or other work, we'll be sure to note it in the description below and will provide info on how to watch. All of our festival interviews will premiere here on YouTube during the week of September 21st. We're calling this our work from home edition of After School Special, and our guests are zooming in from all over the world, from Singapore and Germany to Canada and California. A full schedule of After School Special 2020 interviews can be found at svatheater.com, but all videos will remain on YouTube following their premieres. I hope you enjoyed tonight's interview, and if you're interested in viewing past After School Special Q&As, you can visit the School of Visual Arts' YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in, and fingers crossed, we hope to see you in person at an SVA Theater event in the near future. Hi, good evening and welcome. This Q&A is dedicated to the art of documentary film editing. SVA is so proud to have many successful film editors in its alumni base, but specifically, we want to focus on documentary editing this evening. We have two of those editors from our alumni base joining us. I'd like to first welcome Ann Collins, who's a graduate of SVA's MFA Art Writing program and a faculty member of our MFA Social Documentary program. I'd next like to welcome Victor Il Yukin, who is a student of Ann's in the Social Documentary program, which he graduated from in 2014. Just a little bit about each one of them. Ann Collins is best known for her work as an editor on Griffin Dunn's documentary, Joan Didion, The Center Will Not Hold, as well as the documentaries Swim Team and the Oscar-nominated Sound and Fury. Her films have premiered at many major festivals, including Sundance, Berlin, and the New York Film Festival. Her most recent film, Ms. Diagnosed, premiered on the festival scene earlier this year, and she was one of three editors on the docu-series The Pharmacist, which premiered on Netflix to critical acclaim in February. One of the other editors I should note was Erin Yanes, who is also an SVA alumnus from our undergraduate film program. Victor Il Yukin served on the producing team of Elephant Path, which was acquired by PBS's World Channel and Al Jazeera, and he produced Busy Inside, which was also acquired by PBS. The latter film premiered at the Moscow International Film Festival and screened at Doc NYC, IFP Film Week, at the Hamptons Film Festival, and won the Audience Award at the Middlebury Film Festival. Most recently, Victor directed 2 and 20 Troubles and edited Secret Music, both of which have been playing the festival circuit. He also served on the editing team of HBO's Welcome to Chechnya, which premiered at Sundance earlier this year, where it won a special editing award. So let's please welcome Ann and Victor. Hey to you both, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'd love for you first, before we delve into your film careers, I'd like to hear about your SVA experiences. You know, Ann, you and Victor met in the social documentary film program where you were teaching him in a class, and you were a faculty member when you chose to go back and get your master's in art writing. So can you talk about that whole experience with SVA?
Sure. I was working, I'd been working for a long time as a freelance documentary film editor here in New York. And I was good friends with Mauro Tremaeff, who is the founder and chair of the Masters in Social Documentary. And Mauro called me one day and she said, I'm starting a new department at SVA. It's going to open in 4 years. I want you to teach. And I said, okay, call me in 4 years. And she said, no, I need you right now. We need to design a curriculum, and I have architects that work on the space. And slowly we started to, with other faculty and other people involved in the department and at SVA, to build this new program, which was really exciting. And I continued, working as a freelance film editor and teaching, in the mornings or at night, around my work schedule. SVA is a school built of working professionals. So I was doing that. And when I would go into, in and out of the building, there were these bookmarks, and I'm a big reader. So, I always need a bookmark. There were these bookmarks that said, become one of those who notices things. It had this Henry James quote on it, and it was from the Department of Art Criticism and Writing. And I used to take the bookmark and think, I wonder what they do in that department. I wonder what they do. And after a few years of teaching, and really thinking about what a master's allows a person to do for 2 years, and the intensity of working, in a field, kind of having graduated from an undergrad program and perhaps worked or perhaps had life experiences, or even just coming out of an undergrad program, that sort of additional educational opportunity, and, in the case of SVA, creative opportunity, was very intriguing to me. I also, when I'm not working, I am a person who sees every museum show and walks around galleries. I've always loved, the art scene in New York, and have, taken part in experiencing all of that. That's sort of like the first thing I do after I end a job, is I go up to the Met, or I go up to the MoMA, or I check out, I walk around Chelsea. So one day I had finished a job, and I started Googling masters at SVA, and kept circling back to the art criticism and writing. Now it's the art writing program, and went and met Annette Warren, who runs the program. David Levi Strauss is the chair, and Annette is sort of the, boots on the ground person. And, she took me into this space, which is just this incredible room filled with books, about art and of art works and things like that. And I met Levi and chatted with him, and, and just fell in love with the idea of spending time thinking about art, and thinking about, more specifically, the image and how the image affects us, and started to realize that that's what I had been doing as a film editor for, close to 20 years at that point, that really, really thinking about the meaning of an image, or the meaning of, a clip of motion picture, or, the juxtaposition of music with, a visual, and how that works, and how that affects us, and how we, in turn kind of affect meaning, was incredibly interesting to me. And I was able to go to that department part-time. It took me like 5 years to get the master's, and to write the thesis. And it was a wonderful thing, because I am a big believer that, artists of any kind don't need to be limited to one domain, that, painters can be potters, and, architects can be bakers, and, and so to have a writing component as part of my art making practice, in addition to editing, was just this wonderful, wonderful thing. The two kind of feed each other. It really changed the way I think about editing. It really changed the way I approach my work, and it also changed the way I teach editing. So it was a wonderful kind of unexpected path to go down that actually integrated beautifully into everything else I do. So I'm very grateful to the School of Visual Arts for that department, and I'm incredibly grateful to David Levi Strauss and the art writing department for the ways that it changed me.
Well, that's a great plug. Thank you so much. We didn't pay for that advertisement. Hopefully, YouTube won't take something off the back end. But Victor, you came over from Russia specifically for this program. So I'd love to hear how you made that decision. And if you want to tell us about the class where you met Anne, I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. I actually didn't know, Anne, that you were also learning at the same time as teaching. Like, that's new information.
Not when you were there. I did it later. Not when you were there.
Oh, wow. It's like your schedule was even crazier at the time.
I discovered 4 a.m. is this window where you can get stuff done. I just woke up at 4 a.m. for 5 years and got everything done, you know.
Yeah, the reason I'm mentioning it because Ant's class, at least for us, was very, very early, and like the first class, and everyone was editing all night, is so sleepy, but and has such a big energy in the mornings and so entertaining and active, and so we couldn't fall asleep. It was very interesting. I came to the program because my good friend Olga Lvov, with whom we already directed and produced Busy Inside, my recent documentary. She came to the program 1 year before me, and so I was looking for documentary film programs because in Russia I studied journalism and I worked as a writer producer for TV, but I was really interested in storytelling and the bigger genre that gives you like more artistic freedom to express yourself, and of course it's much more complicated, but I felt like I tried out and I came just to see a lesson. Actually was Ant's class, and after that I made the decision to apply.
So Welcome to Chechnya is, if our viewers aren't familiar with it, is a documentary about members of the LGBTQ community living in Chechnya who are fleeing the country because it's a very oppressive regime there that the leader basically despises members of that community. So it's almost a thriller as we watch these people flee the country. So as you know, as Chechnya is a part of Russia and you yourself are Russian and a member of the LGBTQ community, I'd love to hear your experience working on that and how connected you were to it.
Yeah, so I came in on board because I met David Franz, the director, and he told me about the project, and then it turned out that they don't have a Russian-speaking person on the editing team, and the editor, Tyler Work, he couldn't start actually before everything is translated and kind of assembled. So my first role was to watch all the footage that they shot, and they had incredible access because they were able to film inside the shelters where the activists from Moscow, where LGBT activists, was actually hiding people who flee from Chechnya and then transferring them to other countries, because it has to be an underground operation, because in Chechnya it's also a very deep-rooted kind of phenomenon that they have like this understanding of shame that can only be washed by blood, and actually being a part of the LGBT community is very shameful, and so sometimes they send relatives even after the refugees to kill them. So it's a really, really dangerous operation, and of course the people who were in the shelter came through a lot of trauma, like being betrayed by their families, or being invited to a wedding, and then like Chechen singer Zelim Bakayev, and he came and then he was basically ambushed by his own family and allegedly killed. So I would say that it's a little bit unusual for me to watch all this footage, and because in Moscow and in Russian territory, main Russian territory, it's a little bit different. It's still conservative, but it's not like as mind-blowingly horrifying, because there are tortures involved, people get abducted. Besides the threat from their families, they also been abducted and tortured in secret jails, and some of them did not survive. And they were tortured so they could tell more people, about more people and bring more people. And unfortunately, Chechen government often does such missions where they pick a minority, no matter which one, and kind of target it and attack it to, I don't know, to prove their own power. And I think it was kind of probably the hardest was to go through this footage and you kind of try to be distant and to have some sort of distance, and see it through the lens of the camera, but of course it's like triggers you, and it's something that's like very close to my heart. And I know that's some of members of the team also were receiving therapy after the production ended, because they also, other Russian-speaking members were also very affected by it.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary documentary, and the editing, like I said, it won a special editing award at Sundance. That isn't an award that's given out every year. It's completely riveting and touching, and it is hard to watch, and I can understand why people would need therapy working on it or watching it afterwards. But that being said, I still do encourage people to watch it. If nothing else, it's very enlightening about what is going on there, and that this is still happening. And another very dramatic documentary, the Pharmacist. It focuses on the drug epidemic at large, both an experience with the crack epidemic, and then it goes into the opioid epidemic. This is a docuseries on Netflix. It's in 4 parts, for about an hour-long parts. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about, because this is the first docuseries you've worked on, can you talk about the major differences between editing a series and working with a team of 3 and versus working on a documentary feature?
Sure. The Pharmacist was a different experience for me. I was working with Claire Ave-Lalemont and Aaron Yanes, who are very talented, passionate editors. It was 3 editors on the project, which is really different than kind of coming on to something on your own. They had started before I came onto the project. I came on right when they were sending their, I think they were sending their selects reel. So like a sample of all of their footage laid out in it, more or less sort of the chronology of the film, to Netflix for approval. And I came on to help them craft the first rough cut, and I stayed on through picture lock, which is when you're done with the editing process. It was wonderful. It was great to have, there was so much footage involved in that project, and it was such a long amount of screen time, because it's 4 hours long, that it was great to have 2 other minds and 2 other sets of eyes, in addition to producers and directors who were coming in and out, of course. But it was really nice to have colleagues in the editing room, or they were in, adjacent editing rooms, who could say, I just saw something and it's got a little tiny American flag in the corner. I pulled it for you and I put it in a bin and it's in your computer now, because we were sharing media. Or to say, how did you handle this? How are you handling, there were a lot of moments of, death or chase scenes, or there's a lot of ups and downs in the Pharmacist, and to just see how they were handling things in other parts of the story. The other big difference in a series compared to, an independent documentary, which is anywhere from an hour to 90 minutes to 100 minutes long, is that you, and Victor knows this from my class, we always look for a 3-act structure, and the 3-act structure goes back to Greek theater and Greek poetry and Aristotle, but we always look for that 3-act structure for a beginning, a middle, and an end. And within that structure, as an editor, as a documentary film editor, you're looking at that structure and you're looking for moments that you can kind of heighten to give you, an event that happens that spins your characters into the next scene. It's something screenwriters work with in feature filmmaking and fiction filmmaking, but it's what documentary film editors are always looking at, how to shape the chaos of, the ordinary everyday life into a story, into a storytelling tradition that audiences plug into, that we're all kind of program to plug into. So when you're working on a series, you have to have that 3-act structure in every episode. Every episode has a beginning, middle, and end. But you can't completely end the story. You've got to pitch your episode into the next episode. So you've got to kind of have these 3-act structures recur over time without fatiguing kind of the story, if that makes sense. So you're, it's a little bit more of a marathon or maybe a triathlon or something like that, because you're working and crafting one episode, but then you're constantly thinking about how is that going to inform what's coming next, or how what you're working on is informed by what precedes it, what's going on in the episode previous to the one that you're working on, what's being set up, what seeds are being planted, and how are you going to kind of cultivate that. So it's it's a longer process. It's sort of a broader field to have to think about. So it's great to have strong collaborators on that. And we had it was a wonderful team. The entire team was wonderful. From the directors to the producers to the assistant editors. We had a great post-production supervisor on board, making sure that every piece of footage was accounted for and that the graphics were coming in, and, kind of pushing the graphics team to, really create stuff that was, that told stories in ways that maybe the archival footage or the verite footage couldn't. But it's a much bigger effort, and it's just really, really nice to have, support and company on something like that.
That's great. I'd like to talk a little bit more about documentary editing specifically, beyond just, the work you've been doing recently. For me, from my understanding, narrative film, you're working with a script, and yes, you might have many takes of the same scene, but you're still following a script, and the director is choosing which takes he wants. And, but for documentary editing, you're piecing together not only potentially different takes from interviews, but hours upon hours of interviews, B-roll, archival and found footage. You have, in the Pharmacist, there's a lot of audio tapes and reenactments as well. And so, and the same goes for Welcome to Chechnya and the other documentaries you've worked on, Victor. So in that case, I assume that the editors have a much stronger say, as it were, almost maybe to the same level as the director in shaping how the story eventually is seen. Do you share that opinion, or do you, I'd really just love to hear what you would have to say about that.
I think definitely in documentary filmmaking, the editor has a lot more, I don't want to say power, but like input into how the story will be shaped. And oftentimes the producers and the directors, they have in mind a certain concept, but just because they were so close to the story, they couldn't really see that maybe in the footage there is something stronger, or it's better to focus on the other character actually to so that the point comes across. And I think that's just the editor, it's a lot of just feeling, like while watching the footage, it's just like feeling where the story is, and intuitively kind of, I guess, finding these pieces of the puzzle, and also the whole picture of the puzzle also changes several times, because you have this one direction you go, and then maybe in the rough cut stage you rethink the chronology, or like really, really digging what the film is about. I think that's working on the structure is essential. Like in Ant's class, we worked with index cards, and since then I also have the board here with index cards. But I think that's for Welcome to Chechnya, especially the editor and myself, we were very involved into like all this, putting these cards in a different order till it clicks. So I think that the overall vision is the director's kind of, but getting to this vision in all those different ways, it's definitely the editor's responsibility.
Nan?
Yeah, I agree with Victor. I sometimes feel like it's, there's that fairy tale Rumpelstiltskin where somebody's locked in a tower and there's all this straw and they have to spin it into gold by morning. I often feel like that's the situation you're in as an editor. It's usually not life-threatening, thank goodness, but it is this strange kind of alchemical task that you have to kind of perform. And I think, Victor's, using the language I would use, that it's a director has a vision, has been moved by something, has put a tremendous amount of energy and effort into capturing a story. And when you come into the editing room, the editor has this fresh perspective on things and this fresh take on things and enters into this wonderful conversation, this collaborative conversation with a director, listening to sort of what they're excited about and what they see and how they see it. And then you are tasked with the job of literally telling the story. And when I say telling the story, I mean finding, the image of the sun rising that starts the film or whatever you're going to use, somebody working at something or somebody, feet running or the sound of water or whatever it is, how do you come up with once upon a time? What is that? How do you translate concepts like that into cinematic terms? And so the editor kind of takes this chaos of enthusiasm that comes into the editing room, in the form of media, in the form of images and sounds, and hashes through all of that and processes all of that and processes it, in their minds as well as on screen, and starts putting it together and starts shaping things. People think editing is about extraction, but it's actually about addition. It's about shaping things and putting things into a certain order and a certain sequencing, a certain chain of events that brings to light that vision and does it in a way that aesthetically matches the subject, and in a way that has some kind of emotional impact on an audience that's very specific and unique to cinema. And that's also kind of magical because it's nonfiction. It's something that really happened. It's sort of taking the chaos of the world and translating it into cinema, which is no small task in shaping it.
Now, Anne, you've mainly been an editor. You've also produced. Have you ever directed, or do you hope to direct at some point, or you're mainly focused on editing?
It's really funny. I adore editing. I love that when I sit down in the morning as an editor, I start telling the story. And when when it's the end of the day or the evening or whenever I'm stopping, I am telling the story all day long. I've been just thinking about the story and how to tell the story and how the story is shaping up. I went to an undergrad film program and, had to do everything, had to produce and had to do sound and had to shoot. And I do not like standing outside in the freezing cold. So that eliminated a great deal of jobs in the film industry for me. I really like being indoors, like with a cup of tea and a computer. I'm that kind of person. I also am a person, as somebody once said to me, I am a person who needs to earn a living. And editing is a craft, that allows you to work for a long stretch of time, for months on end. And I just have a life situation that requires that. So I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. And, Victor, you recently directed a film. So to me, looks like, you've directed, produced, edited. Is there one position on the film that you liked? Do you like to have more control as a director, or, have you sort of found a niche in editing, or are you still trying a lot of things out?
I think it really depends because in the program we were also tasked with making our own films, and I think each of us was kind of ambitious towards like being a director, right? But the director needs to learn all these other crafts, and but I think the mentality after the program still stays like you kind of overall you have you can be involved in any part of this process. And even if some people focus on just filming or editing. I know many examples, and among professors as well, where they have the editing phase and then they go back to producing phase. Like they direct on their own project, but at the same time they work as story consultant or an editor for another project. And I feel like that's the reality. And moreover, like right now with Busy Inside, the film we made about people with multiple personality disorder, we are in distribution stage, and it's also a kind of you're on your own, because even with films agents, you have to do a lot of work and learn about it. So you kind of become this entrepreneur suddenly, and learn about self-distribution and stuff. And I feel like all these processes are very creative. They're all interconnected. And yes, lately, like for a few years, I've been focusing on editing, but I totally see myself like doing everything at once, or a few years that, few years another thing. I think it's just natural stream of things in industry.
That's great. And you've been working in documentary films since the mid-90s. Have you seen the field change over time? And specifically, as a woman working in the field, have you ever encountered any challenges? And hopefully those have gotten better throughout the years, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. When I started editing the first film I cut on 16 millimeter film. So I started just before digitized filmmaking, specifically like the Avid or Premiere or Final Cut came into being. So it was a very tactile craft when I started. And it was sort of, there were more people in the editing room. I started as an apprentice film editor, and then I worked my way up to an assistant film editor, and then I started editing. And the whole time that I was working in those, sort of early positions, I was in a room with an editor and a director silently, hearing their conversations and hearing, because my back was usually to the editor, hearing the film develop and watching the film develop. They'd stop and screen, and we'd stop what we were doing to be quiet, and we'd watch rough cuts. And, I was learning by osmosis that way, which was really wonderful. And sort of the craft was handed down. When the director wasn't there, the editor might give you something to cut, or might be trying to solve a problem and might kind of have a eureka moment and turn and go, oh, I just figured out how to do it. Look, and show you what to do, or give you small tasks to do and kind of mentor you through that. One of the reasons I was excited to teach at the School of Visual Arts is because with the advent of, computer-based editing systems, the assistant isn't present in the room anymore with the director and the editor. And the craft, I thought that tradition of handing down the craft was disappearing, and people were learning software and confusing that with learning craft. And because I came of age, I worked at the Maisels, and I worked for a lot of independent filmmakers, George Butler, and some great editors who were handing that craft down to me. I worried that was going to disappear, that a lot of the kind of nuanced things about documentary film editing that you might not notice, that you hopefully don't notice when you're watching a film, we're going to kind of die out, as the technology changed. So that mentorship has been a problem, which is why film schools are wonderful things, and workshops and festivals and things like that bring people together, bring craft people together in every domain. I think that's true of a lot of domains, of producing and directing, as well. And cinematography as well, that handing down of craft. But the other thing that's changed recently is that with streaming platforms, we're in sort of this early golden age of the series. Things are, people are, especially in this moment, when we're still in semi-lockdown with COVID-19, we're home and we're binge watching, right? And so stories, a lot of the stories that are being funded, and a lot of stories that are being told are longer in scope. They're episodic, and there's so many documentary series being made, in addition to individual, 90-minute, 100-minute films that are being made. So there are so many forms of the genre kind of, branching off and evolving at this moment. And that's changed a lot. So.
Well, speaking of the pandemic, and Victor, will bounce back to you. You know, you've had a great year. You've had several films that have come out that you worked on in different capacities. I mentioned, you know, besides Welcome to Chechnya, we have Busy Inside, which you noted, which you produced, and then 2 and 20 Troubles, which you directed, and Secret Music, which you edited. Can you talk about, especially some of those films that aren't widely distributed yet? Can you talk about where they've gone thus far this year to any festivals, and if they're going to be widely distributed, or if there's a place that we can find them online? And additionally, tell us what you've been up to during the pandemic, how you've been working, and if what we can look for from you next.
I think this year was for me a year of distribution, because so many projects were finalized, but then you, as a filmmaker, you need to try to find the audience and get it out, and it's really, really hard unless you know, Sundance competition, and many of us just not. So it's really challenging, and it's always it's on your shoulders, and you kind of have to figure out how to make your film visible amongst many other projects. So, you know, we've joined this year. We've joined New Day Filmmakers Co-op, where I think it's a really exciting opportunity, because filmmakers help each other to distribute their films and to contact libraries, to go to conferences, to go to universities, and they have a catalog that they all kind of trying to promote, and it's something new in the industry. And you know, I think it's very important to be a part of this networking communities, because since I finished the program, you for a while you feel a little bit isolated, because you've had all this community just, you know, sitting around in the editing suites, and you could go to the corridor and chat about your movie, but then you kind of lose it for a bit, and you need to either stay in touch, which could be difficult, or you know, find a place where you're always kind of inspired by others and pushed by others, and you can ask for help. Another organization I also joined this year was Documentary Producers Alliance, which is great. They're doing a lot of work to try to make filmmaking sustainable, and for like a career, because it's also a huge problem, especially for documentary filmmakers. They have to invest their own money and be just enthusiastic about what they're doing, and maybe later they will sell, maybe not, so they lose their wealth, and they lose, you know, they frankly it can be in debt. Like it's a very competitive, and I think it's great that there are organizations that are trying to find new ways to produce, and smarter ways to find sponsors, and do fundraising and development. But the biggest project that we were supposed to do during the pandemics is our next project was All the Love. Its working title is From Time to Time, and it was supposed to be in Russia and 5 different regions, and we would go and see traditional New Year's celebration of different ethnic and religious groups, from Buddhist in Siberia to Cult of the Dead in Middle Russia, Muslim and Christian. And it would be like this screenshot of Russia, which I think oftentimes this is an unseen Russia for an American audience, and which they don't know much about, but at the same time very similar country in terms of diversity, and you know, just this vast multicultural geography. And we were supposed to film in May, but just because of the pandemics now, like all this pushed, maybe hopefully to 2021. So we'll see.
Well, I hope that pans out. It sounds like a very interesting topic. And Anne, are you working right now during the pandemic?
I am.
On a film.
I am working on my tan. No, I am working on a film. I've been really lucky. I've been working on a project about Miami Lighthouse for the blind, which is being produced by Simon Plus Films, and Deborah Dixon is directing it. Victor knows Deborah very well. And that's been delightful, but we are, we've been cutting our footage. It's a verite documentary, and there are sort of final scenes with each character that we were scheduled to shoot in the middle of March. March 16th, 17th, 18th were big shoot days for us. That whole week were big shoot days. And if you think about those dates, March 15th was the day that New York City was put into lockdown, and none of our crew, in the week leading up to that, were able to commit to flying to Miami. It's being filmed in Miami. Miami's in lockdown. So that whole story will get our endings for our characters, but when we'll get them is a question. So that's been affected by the pandemic. In the meantime, I'm finishing up another project called Bill T. Jones, Can You Bring It?, which is being directed by Tom Hurwitz and Rosalind LeBlanc. And that's the story of Bill T. Jones, the great American choreographer Bill T. Jones, and his masterpiece, D-Man in the Waters, which is a dance that he made during the AIDS epidemic when he was grieving his partner and lover, Arnie Zane, who succumbed to AIDS, in the months before he made it. They had secured funding to make this dance, and Arnie passed away, and Bill was left alone to create this dance. And so tells the story of how art making kind of lifted him, kind of carried him through his grief, and as well as his company, the dancers in his company, how working on this very difficult dance sustained them and brought them together and gave them a place to come and to collectively grieve. So it's been a really fun project.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for those in the coming years. Both Anne and Victor have IMDb profiles which list their full credits. So if you're interested in what they've worked on, I encourage you to check that out. And most of their films can be found online. Specifically, Victor's website is diplodocusfilms.com, and we'll put that in the YouTube information. And the films that are upcoming that he mentioned are listed on there. Victor, you gave some good tips about how to stay involved with other documentarians and filmmakers during the pandemic, which I think is great. Do you have any other advice that you'd like to offer students or people who are interested in breaking into this field, and maybe specifically editors right now? And, as we're facing a pandemic, but maybe more broadly about breaking in and how to find work in documentaries.
Well, think twice before you go into. But if you actually have this passion for storytelling and documentary films, I think the best way is to meet people. And for me, it was to assist, like I mentioned, assist really great editors, Paul Rappaport and Tyler Walk and David Bartner, and I think they all really helped me. I was insisting on giving me some scenes, talking to them about what they did during the day, cutting some extra sequence to show them that I found. And I think this way you really, really learn a lot. And if you have an editor and most of them are very friendly and supportive, then probably you'll have great conversations. And from there you'll see you'll be able to master your editing skills.
And besides taking your class, what other advice would you recommend for students or folks who are interested in breaking into the field?
Well, Victor was my student. He was a wonderful student, and his editing work was, he was very passionate about editing. He was very meticulous and concise and creative when it came to editing. But what Victor did that was so smart is when he finished the program, he let me know that he wanted to work as an editor. And he sent me emails. We sometimes saw each other at industry events or social events. And, and Victor, I hope you still will now that you're a big editor, would drop me an email and say, I'm looking for work, and Victor was such a dear student, I was more than happy. I was delighted to hear this. And sometimes when you're a freelance worker of any, in any capacity in this business, you might be a little bit busy, but just getting that little note that says, hey, I'm looking for work, or think of me, or if you know anybody who's looking, it's all you need. And then, maybe a week or a month or whatever, at some point, somebody will send you, I'll get a text from somebody saying, I need somebody. And I'll say, Victor,
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh no, I love Victor. You know how I feel about you, but it's really nice to do that. And I always encourage students to maintain that community, to stay in touch with each other, because you might have a friend in film school who goes in one direction for a while and then circles back to something that intersects more with what you're doing. And I think Victor has been great at maintaining his social connections, with a sincerity to want to stay in touch with the people that he's close to. But I also think that that's I have some of my, most of my best friends are editors just because we have so much in common. But forming community is really important, whether it's, through social media or, someday when we can all see each other again, that's important. I also sometimes get emails out of the blue from assistant editors just introducing themselves, who've maybe watched my work. I think that's a good idea. When I was first freelancing, I wasn't hearing about fabulous jobs. I was hearing about, what we sometimes call as bread and butter gigs. But I would recommend editors whose work I really admired to other producers in the hopes that they would then recommend me in turn. And I think that's a great way to kind of build a network. I would sometimes, at one point I was recommending a very big editor who did not know me for tons of work that was beneath her. And she eventually sent me an email and said, oh my gosh, thank you so much, whoever you are, for recommending me for all of these jobs, and started recommending me for work. So, just it's about community and about sharing, not kind of keeping your jobs to yourself. If I'm working on something and I hear about another job, I really want to recommend it to someone, whom, I admire, someone, that I know and admire. I want us all to be working. I think of it that way. I don't think of it as a competition. I think of it as a collaborative community.
And have you two ever worked on the same project yet?
Not yet. Not yet.
Hopefully soon.
In the future.
Although I did recommend Victor to one of my dearest friends, too, the great filmmaker and editor Paula Rappaport, who I know from my days at Maisels. I've known Paula since, I was an undergrad, and she was looking for someone, and I would only recommend somebody really special to Paula because she's so dear to me. And I said, Victor, and she adored him, and I think that was
great. It was mutual.
Yeah, she's wonderful. But I think that was pretty soon out of the program. She was looking for someone. And I was like, Victor. She was like, can I meet him? I was like, you don't have to, but you can, and that worked out really well.
Well, that's great. Hopefully the two of you do get the chance to work together at some point. I'd love to see that piece. I really can't recommend either documentary enough. Both of them are both films, specifically the newest ones that we've been talking about, The Pharmacist on Netflix and Welcome to Chechnya on HBO, are completely riveting, and I strongly encourage you to check them out. We'll provide links in the information below this video. I want to thank both Anne and Victor for being here today. I thought the information you provided was terrific, and I wish you the best of luck on your current and future projects. And I encourage everyone to check out the other films that we've mentioned throughout this interview. I think that their work is really outstanding, and congratulations to both of you on your films. And we can't wait to see more from you. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Adam.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this Q&A and hope you'll check out our other after-school special videos on the School of Visual Arts' YouTube channel. Thank you for your interest in and support of SVA and its alumni, and for your support of the arts in general. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be well.